On the night of the 2nd of March 3019, Isengard's army crossed into Rohan. With Rohan's defenders either scattered or in full retreat, Saruman's army had their pick of targets across the country, but they didn't march very far, sweeping across the Westfold and assaulting the fortress of Helm's Deep. By the morning of the 4th, the assault had failed, and trapped between the defenders, reinforcements led by Erkenbrand, and a forest of angry Huorns, Isengard's army was annihilated. So let's ask the question, with the ability to go anywhere in Rohan, why did Isengard's army immediately assault Helm's Deep? On the night of the 2nd of March, things looked grim for Rohan. Both banks of the Fords of Isen had been lost. Grimbold and his remaining men had scattered into the hills. Erkenbrand was missing, and Elfhelm was in full retreat across the plains, with the Riders of the Westfold no longer being a coherent fighting force, and with most of the riders from Rohan's other regions yet to be mustered, it seemed like the kingdom was defenseless. The only glimmer of hope for Rohan was that Gandalf had healed Theoden, and now the king was rushing west with 1,000 riders. His force paled in comparison to Isengard's army, which numbered at least 10,000 and included strong units such as Warg Riders, Dunlending Horsemen, and Uruk-hai and half-orc heavy infantry. It would take days for Rohan to muster a force to fight this army in the field, days in which Isengard's army could sweep across Rohan and ravage the kingdom. But instead of doing that, Isengard's army took a right-hand turn and marched into the Deeping Combe, where one could find the fortress of the Hornburg in Helm's Deep. Not wasting any time, the Isengarders attacked the fortress, and the rest you know. So why attack Helm's Deep, which was one of the strongest fortresses in Middle-earth built by the ancient Númenóreans? Why risk your only army on such an audacious assault? Why not instead rush across the plains and seize Edoras, the capital, which was far easier to take? Why not send raiders across the plains to destroy Rohan's lightly defended settlements, crippling the kingdom's ability to strike back? This isn't to say that attacking Helm's Deep was a terrible idea that was doomed to fail. After all, when Saruman's army had crossed the Fords of Isen, the garrison was only 1,000 men, most of them too young or too old. Given that Saruman's army had plenty of siege equipment and had some sort of blasting fire that was capable of taking down the walls and the gates, the fortress probably would have fallen quite easily. Then, Isengard's army could have resupplied using resources from the Hornburg, and then continued on rampaging across Rohan. The arrival of Theoden and his 1,000 reinforcements complicated the matter. Sure, Theoden's men were also mostly young or old, but they were actual soldiers, and it made the odds for the defenders much better. But it's not like Isengard's army could receive different orders at this point, because when they arrived at Helm's Deep, Isengard had actually already fallen to the Ents, so the attack would continue as planned, more difficult, but if successful, it would mean most of Rohan's leadership, Theoden and Eomer, would be wiped out. The simple answer is that Isengard had to attack Helm's Deep if it wanted to destroy Rohan. Saruman didn't have a choice, and to understand why, you need to understand a little more about Rohan. While most of Rohan is open plains, most of the Rohirrim do not live on those plains. Instead, they live in the valleys of the White Mountains, and mountains are the perfect place to take refuge in times of crisis. The people of the Westfold had Helm's Deep and the glittering caves beyond, and the people of Edoras and the Eastfold had the daunting refuge of Dunharrow. So one could control the plains of Rohan, but still find the people of Rohan out of reach. There's historical precedence to this. In 2758, Rohan was invaded by Dunlendings and Corsairs from the west and Easterlings from the east. Rohan was completely overrun, and even Edoras was taken by the Dunlendings. Most of the surviving Rohirrim took refuge in places like Dunharrow, Helm's Deep, and presumably other mountain refuges. The Dunlendings didn't even try to take Dunharrow, and they lacked the strength to assault Helm's Deep, and thanks to the long winter, the Rohirrim were actually able to outlast the Dunlending occupiers. In the spring, the Rohirrim sallied forth, took back Edoras, and with the help of Gondor, freed their kingdom. Sure, they lost a lot of people, but they were able to survive thanks to the mountains. So if Isengard's forces ignored Helm's Deep and marched on Edoras or Alberg, there's two major problems. Firstly, leaving a fortress manned by 2,000 men, many of them heavy cavalry, at your rear is a terrible idea. Leaving Theoden alone would give him more time to gather more men, especially amongst the survivors from the Fords of Isen. He could rally as many as 3,000 horsemen. That's not to mention that more forces could be rallied in the Eastfold, and Isengard's army might find itself trapped between two armies of cavalry. This, naturally, would be a disaster. Secondly, marching across the plains to Edoras wouldn't actually achieve much. The people in and around Edoras would simply give up the capital and flee to Dunharrow, which, like Helm's Deep, would also be difficult to take by force. Sure, the people on the plains of Rohan might be easier targets, but like I said earlier, the plains were sparsely populated, and many of those who lived on the plains, especially in the north, were semi-nomadic shepherds and herdsmen who would be difficult to track down and wipe out anyway. Controlling the plains does not destroy Rohan. So in order to neutralize Rohan's military and destroy its people, Saruman had to target its refuges. It just so happened that Helm's Deep was the first and the most powerful refuge in Isengard's path, hence why the army was well equipped to deal with the fortress. You might also ask, why launch a costly assault against Helm's Deep and not simply besiege it? Well, this doesn't actually solve any of Saruman's problems. On the grand strategy level, we're not exactly sure what Saruman's plan was at this point. He'd failed to acquire the One Ring, and Sauron knew that he was a traitor, so he was either attempting to destroy Rohan as quickly as possible to get back on Sauron's good side, or was planning on using Rohan's resources to build a bigger, stronger army for a possible showdown with Mordor. Either way, Saruman did not have the time for a lengthy siege, because Sauron was planning on attacking Gondor soon. But even at a local strategy level, attempting to starve out Helm's Deep would achieve nothing. The Dunlendings had attempted it several centuries ago, and perhaps they would have been successful if not for the long winter, because the Rohirrim at Helm's Deep were slowly starving. This time, the circumstances were a lot different. The glittering caves beyond Helm's Deep were fully stockpiled with supplies and animals, meaning that it would take a long time for the defenders to start starving. In fact, Saruman's army would starve first. They had burned the lands behind them, and Isengard's destruction meant that no supplies would be forthcoming. And given that Saruman's forces did not control the rest of Rohan yet, a relief army could be gathered to save the fortress. To make matters worse, for Saruman's army, it would be extremely difficult to defend against this. The White Mountains were full of mountain roads, and one could ride from Helm's Deep to Dunharrow using these paths. So basically, a relief army could gather within the mountains and then pop up right next to Helm's Deep, beyond the sight of Saruman's scouts and raiders. This isn't really a hypothetical, it's basically what happened. Gandalf gathered together Erkenbrand, Grimbold, and 1,000 survivors from the Battle of the Fords of Isen, and they arrived to relieve the fortress, although the Isengarders were already in full retreat at this time. So yeah, if Saruman wanted to knock Rohan out of the war as quickly as possible, he needed to attack Helm's Deep. It would remove Rohan's most powerful fortress, it would wipe out most of the Westfold's people, and as events would unfold, it would also result in the death of Theoden and Eomer. On the other hand, ignoring the fortress and marching on Edoras would be a major strategic error, but would also achieve nothing, and those Rohirrim would also just flee into the mountains. And Saruman couldn't starve out the fortress either. He didn't have enough time, and it wouldn't be possible because the defenders were better supplied. This all might make it seem like Saruman's chances of success were slim from the very beginning, but in reality, Saruman had a great chance, he just let it slip through his fingers. After the first battle of the Fords of Isen on the 25th, Theoden was incapable, Theodred was dead, and when messengers arrived at Edoras to ask Eomer for reinforcements, he had already left to hunt orcs in the Eastfold. If Saruman had attacked again immediately, he could have found Helm's Deep poorly defended, with no reinforcements arriving from the east. Instead, he waited a full 7 days. It's unclear why. Maybe he was waiting for his servants to return with the One Ring, maybe he was hoping for Eomer to be dealt with first. No matter the reason, waiting 7 days allowed Gandalf to reveal Grima's treachery and heal Theoden, giving the king just enough time to reinforce Helm's Deep. So, Saruman screwed Saruman. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I think the battles between Rohan and Isengard is a real underrated part of the story, because there were a lot more factors at play than, say, the war between Gondor and Mordor. It's intriguing because you can see how Saruman's complicated strategy plays out, but you can also see how the wizard's clear mistakes led to his own demise. Cheers, farewell, and remember, a trebuchet is the perfect siege engine.